The first time this woman saw my son's dog, it was like watching someone face the end of time. She stood in front of the house, arms crossed, looking at the dog with as much suspicion as if he were an undercover agent for the pet shop mafia. I noticed the look on her face, that crooked little smile that doesn't come from sympathy, but from canned judgment, like someone who thinks they know everything about other people's lives based on the color of the grass and the car parked in the garage. The dog, a black Labrador, calm, with an official collar and service harness, was next to my son, who has been blind since he was 3. They were both on their way home from school, a simple routine. Walk from the sidewalk to the gate, 30 seconds of walking. But to her, it seemed like the parade of an existential threat. And of course, she couldn't keep quiet. She never can. The next day, I found a printed letter on the hood of my car, thick paper, an HOA stamp in the corner, and a message written as if it had been drafted by a fashion court intern. Dear resident, we have noticed the presence of a medium-sized animal in your residence, contrary to the condominium's internal regulations. We request its immediate removal, as it is a destabilizing element in the community environment. Destabilizing element. They were talking about a guide dog, a trained, certified animal that literally prevents my son from hitting his face on a lamppost. But for her, it was an aesthetic nuisance, a problem with the chromatic scale of the scene that she thought she was in charge of. I took a deep breath. I explained by email, with a copy to the entire HOA, that this was a guide dog protected by federal law, that my son was severely visually impaired, and that this was not an option. It was a necessity. I thought that was enough, that a polite, simple explanation with the documents attached would solve the misunderstanding. Of course it didn't. The following week, she approached me in the garden, in the passive-aggressive way that only people like that know how to do. She came walking out with a blue folder and a tablet in her hand. She said she'd received my email, but that, unfortunately, she couldn't make any exceptions, that the statute was clear, that the dog was not on the list of permitted animals, and that she even doubted whether my son was really blind. I froze, because there are things you hear, and your brain simply refuses to process. She said it as politely as possible, but the content was poison. She doubted my son's blindness. She said that he looked straight ahead when he walked, and that she had seen him dodge a hole in the sidewalk. She tried to convince me that if he could walk without tripping, it was because he could see something. I had no idea what sensory training was, spatial memory, using sounds as a reference. Nothing. She only saw what she wanted to see, and what she saw was a boy with a dog who didn't fit in with the vibe of the neighborhood. But what really got me was when she said, "I've already called the police. They're coming to check. If the animal is illegal, it will be removed immediately." That's when I realized that this wasn't about regulation. It was about control, about feeling like the owner of something that never belonged to her. The police showed up. 2 young officers, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. One of them apologized before he even got out of the car. She was standing next to them, with a smile at the corner of her mouth, like someone expecting a trophy for her service to the country of good taste. The officer approached and said, "We received a call. They said there was an unauthorized animal living here. The HOA claimed that the dog had no valid registration." He barely finished speaking. I went into the house, got the folder with the documents. I showed them the dog's ID, the guide dog certificate, my son's card, everything, and along with it, my federal judge's badge. I put it on the table calmly, without haste, not angrily, but with a look that said everything that words didn't need to say. The silence was heavy. Her face went pale, half trying to understand what she had gotten herself into. The policeman looked at me, at the dog, at the boy, and back at her. Without saying anything, he just thanked her, took the documents, and went back to his car. She stood there, like someone being slapped invisibly. She didn't know whether to apologize or feign dementia. She ended up doing what she always does. She lifted her chin, turned her back, and walked away, as if she was still right. At that moment, I realized that this went far beyond a dog. It was about who she thought she was. An unelected trustee of morals and good manners, with an imaginary megaphone and an unhealthy fixation on rules that she herself didn't understand. But now she had a bigger problem. Her name was going to appear in a report. And in that report, there was a complaint of discrimination against people with disabilities. She wanted to play authority. She just forgot that justice sometimes lives next door. After the episode with the police, the woman disappeared for a few days. Absolute silence. No note on the door, no emergency HOA meeting, no lecture on the sensory aesthetics of the neighborhood. You could almost believe that she had realized her mistake, that she was going to back down, apologize, and pretend that it was all just a misunderstanding. But peace is short-lived when your ego is the size of a billboard. The following week, I began to notice discreet movements. Emails from the HOA with generic notices about reviewing animal-friendly protocols, extraordinary meetings that only included a few residents, anonymous circulars left in mailboxes with the title, "Do you know the real rights of your neighborhood?" It was her. It signed off as the Community Welfare Commission, a name that never officially existed. Apparently, she was now trying to convince the other residents that my son was a dangerous exception. She said that the dog's presence would set uncontrollable precedents. She started spreading the idea that soon everyone would have excuses to bring animals, that the neighborhood would become an emotional zoo. She used beautiful, twisted words, dressed in concern. She said she loved children, that she respected people with disabilities, that she just wanted to maintain the harmony of the whole. But her speech was poisoned, full of subtle insinuations. A neighbor told me that the woman said that it wasn't fair for a child to alter the lifestyle of balanced adults. Yes, she said that out loud at a community breakfast. My son didn't understand at all, of course. For him, a dog is like a pair of wings. It's not an accessory or a luxury, it's survival. But the mood on the street began to take a toll. Some residents looked away. Others tried to be friendly, but with the tone of someone who didn't want to get involved. There were even people who asked if she really needed a dog, or if there was any new technology that could solve it. The woman planted the doubt. She knew she couldn't get the dog out of the house legally, so she used the old social exclusion trick, helping to push out anyone who didn't fit her standards. Isolate until you're tired. Only she forgot that this time the target was my son. And when the target is my son, I become a wall. While she was trying to undermine me with gossip and fake letterheads, I had already called in the public prosecutor's office. I reported discrimination against people with disabilities based on the Brazilian inclusion law. I'd attached copies of all the notices she'd left, chat logs, group prints, testimonies from neighbors, even the police report of that bizarre attempt to collect the dog with police support. That same month, her name was included in a preliminary investigation. And the most interesting thing, she had no idea. She was too busy trying to organize a new general meeting, where she planned to suggest a clause banning any animal that caused extreme visual disturbance. It was a direct jab at our dog. And again, she used pretty words to hide her rotten prejudice. When the court notice arrived at her house, the scene was priceless. It was an ordinary morning. The letter carrier delivered an envelope with the letterhead of the regional court. She took it, opened it right there in front of the mailbox, and froze. The neighbors said she stared at the paper for about 20 seconds, then went inside like she'd seen a ghost. She didn't leave the house for the rest of the day. The next day, I received a formal email from the HOA canceling the meeting she was organizing. No explanation, no apology, nothing, just the warning. For reasons of force majeure, the agenda has been suspended. 2 days later, another neighbor told her that she had been removed from her informal leadership role. The board, pressured by the legal risk, decided to cut ties. They were terrified that the HOA would be implicated in the complaint, and with good reason, because the lawsuit was going to come out. And when it did, All the names would be there, including those who were omitted. Meanwhile, my son went about his life, calmly, smiling, running his fingers along the dog's back, who responded with a slight movement of his head. A silent, perfect bond. Anyone looking from the outside couldn't see anything much. Just a boy and his dog walking around the block. But those who could really see saw a miracle. The woman. She tried to keep up appearances. She left the house wearing sunglasses, lowered her gaze when she passed us, avoided any kind of interaction. The megaphone of morality had become a whisper of shame, but her silence wouldn't last long. The process was just beginning, and soon the whole neighborhood would know what happens when someone tries to erase a child's rights just because their dog doesn't match the neighbor's white picket fence. When the first official summons reached her, the neighborhood was already divided into 3 groups: those who pretended they had never heard anything, those who knew she had crossed the line and were discreetly cheering her down, and those who still thought she was just over the top, but well-meaning. The latter would soon change their minds. The document cited the exact article of the law on the inclusion of people with disabilities, the section that guarantees access to guide dogs in all collective environments, including residential condominiums. And the accusation was clear: an attempt to prevent a visually impaired child from having the right to move around. The woman went from informal trustee to being investigated. The podium of arrogance became a defendant's bench. Of course, she wasn't going to back down with dignity. People like that prefer the role of martyr to the reality of their mistakes. Rumors soon started that she was being persecuted by a vengeful judge. The narrative became a soap opera about a wronged heroine. It was said that the woman only wanted to maintain order and that she was attacked by someone with more power. It was the old tactic of gourmet victimization, turning discrimination into misunderstanding, turning abuse into community zeal. She started going out again, but now with a new accessory, a clipboard with blank pages and the look of someone who was auditing the world. She wrote everything down: the position of the garbage cans, the type of flower in the flower beds, the minutes a gate was open. I tried to show that I was still active, firm, standing firm. But it wasn't firmness. It was desperation disguised as protocol. One morning, I received a call from the court's press office. The complaint had become a public affair, thanks to an internal leak. A journalist heard the story and thought it was too absurd to ignore. When the story came out, the headline was a straight punch to her reputation. Resident tries to remove blind child's guide dog for disturbing the visual harmony of the condominium. The article included testimonies from neighbors, excerpts from the lawsuit, and an interview with an NGO that supports people with disabilities, which had already taken up the case as a national banner. Other websites quickly replicated the story. In less than 24 hours, it was a meme. Social networks were unforgiving. Internet users made montages of her wearing sunglasses and dog ears, pasted phrases of her next to images of blind children with guide dogs smiling. One user even created a fake profile under the name Karen Anti-Dog and started narrating fictitious situations as if they were her thoughts. The commotion was immediate. The whole country turned against her absurd behavior. But she continued to walk around the neighborhood with the posture of someone who had not yet been defeated, a kind of grandiose denial, where the only way out was to keep pretending she didn't know anything. But the neighborhood no longer looked at her with the same eyes. Sympathy turned into distance. Tolerance became shame. The same people who used to sign petitions with her now crossed the street to avoid saying hello. It was in this context that the most symbolic moment of all took place. The new HOA board organized an event to raise awareness about accessibility, an afternoon of activities, talks, and demonstrations by service dogs, all with the support of the town hall, the NGO involved in the case, and the presence of other families with blind children. My son was invited to open the event. He got up on stage with his dog by his side and took the microphone with a confidence that even I didn't expect. He said very few words. He explained how the dog had changed his life, how he could now walk to school without holding on to his friend's shoulders, how he could cross the street on his own, how he felt freer. The audience gave him a standing ovation. Some people cried. At the back of the event, leaning against a tree, was her, alone, with her arms crossed, with dry eyes, without her clipboard, without her folders, without her leaflets, for the first time, without words. Justice is not only done with laws. Sometimes it comes in the form of the open truth, shown in front of those who tried to distort it. Over the next few days, she stopped going out. She locked herself away. She canceled the groups she was leading. HOA emails were now signed by other people. The committee she created was officially disbanded. Her garage, once impeccably organized, became a pile of mess. And the front door, which she cleaned religiously with a microfiber cloth, was now weather-stained, as if even the house was ashamed. The trial was still going on, but the public judgment had already been ruthless. And the most ironic thing, the dog she had tried to evict had become a symbol of the community. Children petted it every time it passed by. Residents called him by name. It was as if the street had found a new point of balance. The blind boy became a guide, and the woman who wanted to control everything was lost. The neighborhood was never the same again, and that was a good thing. The day of the hearing arrived quietly. No cameras, no press coverage, but the silence of that courtroom carried more weight than any headline. She showed up in a beige dress and an exaggerated necklace, as if the accessory could reverse the moral disgrace she herself had constructed. She walked with the look of someone who still hoped to find applause, but all she found was the dry sound of the door closing behind her. She sat before an impassive prosecutor, before a judge who, by ethics, was not me. My role there was that of a victim, representing my son and his basic right to exist, without having to beg for respect. The woman tried to explain herself, stammering that she never intended to offend, and that she was just following the rules of the community. She claimed ignorance of federal laws. She said she had no idea of the impact she was making. But the impact was there, sitting next to me. A little boy with his eyes closed but his head held high, his hand resting on the dog she tried to erase from the landscape. The judge listened to everything with the coolness that his position demands. At the end, he read the articles of the law slowly. He highlighted the passages that she had violated with her insistence disguised as zeal. And he ended with a sentence that didn't even sound like a sentence, but like a painful realization. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. And prejudice, however polite it may seem, is still a crime. The fine was heavy, but the real weight wasn't in the numbers. The weight came in the obligation to attend a re-education program on the rights of people with disabilities. What's more, it came with the court order to refrain from any direct or indirect contact with our family. The woman left the courtroom without saying a word, like someone who stumbles over her own arrogance and finally realizes that she has fallen from the pedestal that never existed. She returned to the neighborhood the next day, but she was no longer the same person. She walked with her head down, avoided busy streets, and the few times someone tried to say, "Good morning," she replied with a dry nod, as if even the greeting tasted like defeat. Her house became a symbol of what not to do. The once meticulously pruned garden was now just tall grass and accumulated leaves. Perfection became abandonment. The HOA board made a point of issuing a public statement. They admitted that they were wrong to allow someone with no official mandate to create a climate of fear and exclusion in the neighborhood. They promised reforms to the bylaws, included clauses protecting diversity, and organized an awareness campaign on inclusion. To this day, there is a mural in the square with a picture of our dog and the phrase, "Inclusion begins when you decide to see with your heart." The dog continued to do his job with the same quiet dignity as always. The only difference was that now he was liked, respected, almost a local celebrity. Sometimes, when we went for a walk, the children would run up to him, call his name, ask if they could hold the lead for a few seconds, just to feel what it's like to see with their ears and their heart. That woman stayed there for a few more months, trying to go unnoticed, until one day she quietly moved away. A moving truck pulled up early in the morning, and by late afternoon the house was empty. No one missed her, no goodbyes, no tears, just silence as the soundtrack to a well-deserved end. The new resident painted the facade yellow, put colorful chairs on the porch, and planted a sunflower in the middle of the garden. A medium-sized dog now runs around the yard, free and light, as if exorcising the remnants of a bitter presence. No one questioned it. Nobody sent a note. The street learned. Our son has grown up. He still has the same dog, although now more independent, more confident. Blindness was never what defined him. But that dog, that piece of soul on four legs, remains the invisible link between the outside world and his private universe, a link that no one else dared try to break. From time to time, I think of his wife, not with resentment or anger. I think about her like we think about an old nightmare, one that seems too distant to cause fear, but close enough to be remembered. I think about how she wasted the chance to be remembered for something noble. She had a voice, she had influence, she had structure. She chose to use it all to diminish a child, to erase a right, to deny the obvious. But she didn't succeed. Because in the end, justice doesn't wear a cape. Sometimes it comes with a wet muzzle, a collar on its chest and eyes that, even without seeing, see much more than people who insist on walking around with their eyes open to everything but what matters. And if you like this video, don't forget to leave a comment and a like.